Okay, so thank you, Komal Shah, for being here today. A very warm welcome from the other side of the globe. How you doing?
I'm so great. How are you, Mark?
Yeah, I'm really good, thanks. I'm really good and feeling quite energized after finishing your book, Raise Your Hand, Call for Consciousness and Education, and I really got a lot out of it. When did you actually, when was the release date? I mean, it's really recent, isn't it?
Yes, actually, it's been about, I want to say I released, September 9th. So I guess you're reminding me it's been 2 months.
September 9th, and what a whirlwind it must have been since then.
Yes, it has been, it's been amazing in just terms of, people like yourself and other people who have reached out after reading it, parts that resonated with them or parts that made them curious or asked more questions. And, I remember going, whoa, people are reading my book? Like, that's odd. And then and then to have a positive response like that, I think for myself at least, it's very been humbling by any means, because all you really want is for individual people to resonate with the message that you're trying to put out into the world. And so it's been really beautiful to hear the kind words.
I think it's even more for me personally, it's more than even just the message, and we'll get stuck into the book in a second, but like I've never spoken to you personally. This is the
Yeah.
first time we're meeting face to face, but I felt very connected to your journey. It's something you talk about a lot in the book. You talk about vulnerability. You talk about the authentic self, which is something that, my goodness, it's so important. And I saw that on your LinkedIn presence with the way that you were posting around your feelings about the journey towards publication, about actually holding your book for the first time, celebrating with friends and family, and I felt like I was right there with you. And I've I've often had the idea of writing. I mean, I write articles and things. I've often had the idea about writing a book, but never really been called, truly called to do it. And witnessing your journey has actually really lit a fire under me.
Wow, that's amazing. And yes, I always tell everyone, I'm like, you want to write a book, it's possible. If I can do it, anyone can do it. But to your point, one thing I've really realized is community is so important to me, and having the support of people probably has been the most amazing part of it, and also has made me appreciate it more than ever, right? Because as you mentioned, this is not something you can just do yourself, right? We need the community and the support. But it's been amazing sharing my journey. And to your point, it's interesting because people, when they read the book too, they go, oh my gosh, like, this part made me cry. Like I felt like I was in the room with you, or these situations. And, I had an interesting, one person had reached out and said, this felt like it was very cathartic for you. It felt like it was kind of like your diary where you were trying to share your stories. And I said, in a lot of ways it was, because so much had happened over 5 years of teaching. And, as we know, education and teaching is such a whirlwind. And then to be able to sit down and actually reflect and actually write some of those stories and really think about those moments. I mean, it's truly a different experience in itself.
Yeah, I would concur with that. I mean, I had the same sense from reading it, that it seemed like there was a lot of emotion manifest in the pages, which I enjoy. I've got not very much time for small talk, and I really like to connect with things that I'm engaging with, and your book definitely felt like that. And one thing I also liked about it was that it was it's challenging. I mean, as I read through the pages, I was kind of already subconsciously putting it in sort of different boxes. So as you started to put, reveal the anecdotes, it reminded me of like some of Sir Ken Robinson's books, where it's up over anecdotes. I like, it's not, you do have, citations and studies and things through there, but it doesn't feel like an academic text. It feels like an attempt to connect, which I really, really like. And what I loved most about it was, as an educator myself, I really love, I'm always looking for more arrows in the quiver, more ways in which I can communicate these things to other people, or connect with them, or make them, plant seeds. And I loved your use of analogies, the creative use of analogy in there, like your the QWERTY keyboard for unlearning, for example, was simple and powerful. You know, it was something we could all relate to. So your use of metaphor there, your use of prompts for reflection as well. You know, there was a real, you know, it was like Komal, the educator, was definitely present in there as well. Like, how can I get this across? How can I make people internalize it, or help people to internalize it?
Yeah. And you know, what's interesting is that was quite challenging because we all have ideas, we all have visions, but to put it on paper is a very different experience, right? So when you have all of a vision, for example, and then to actually write it in a way and communicate it in a way that others may at least be able to receive it and have access to it, right? In some ways, accessing your brain a little bit. That in itself was a process. And, you know, I had a team of editors and fellow authors who were helping me along that journey, because there were definitely moments where I'm going, this is what I want to say, but how do you say it in a way that someone can understand it, right? Or how do I say it where it resonates? And that's what's so beautiful, though, because when I was able to interview over 70 people internationally about this concept, it was so powerful in itself just to hear their stories, right? And just hearing parts of their own educational journeys, whether it was as a student or as a teacher, or as an educational leader. And so being able to even share their stories was so powerful in itself as well.
Yeah. And it's funny, it doesn't actually feel, when you said you interviewed like 70 people, I mean, it doesn't feel, it's not a heavy book, you know, it's not, there's such a real flow to it going through, and I think that's the real strength of it as well. You know, it was I finished it quite quickly, and I went back and sort of dived into a few pieces again, to sort of, you know, but it was easy to make my way through. And I'm wondering, because so for me, and I think a lot of other people out there, that you get different things from this, you know. I mean, for me it was quite a sense of it was validation in a way, you know. It's for me, what I took from it is, these are the kinds of things I need to be reading to keep the fire lit, you know, because obviously you go out there, the narratives this is not the common thing that we hear out there. This is not the common discussion. One of the things you mentioned was the metaphor about, you know, we're constantly putting out fires without looking for the arsonist. And that really struck me, because it's discussions I've been having in the last few weeks about the essay mills being banned in the UK and Australia. You know, these services where students contract out for essay writers, you know, and they pay somebody to write their essays. And the discussion was just so intense around the ethics of it and whether or not it should be banned and blah, blah, blah. But, you know, I felt like am I going insane here? Like, why are we not talking about what is driving people to do this in the first place? Why are they so disconnected? And sometimes you know, I get to the point, I'm questioning my own sanity. You know, I don't hear this, and then I'm reading your book, and I'm like, okay, thank you, Komal. This is okay. So this is what I'm getting from it. But what I'd like to ask you is about, for when you give this to teachers who are in, you know, they're in the mainstream system, they are in a system that you know intimately, you know exactly what they're experiencing. And I'm talking about the teacher that's perhaps not consciously thinking about what is wrong or with the wider system. It's maybe just a sense of, I'm overwhelmed, I'm frustrated, you know. How do you find your book has connected with them?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think anyone who's more of a traditionalist or who has never actually thought about this, it's been interesting because the first thing they said is, it made me think. It made me think about and question my own education growing up, and also what I'm doing in the classroom. And to me, that's a win, because the first thing for anyone is to actually sit back and go, wait, let me look back on my own journey and see how these parts really resonate. Now, do I expect them to go, the whole system is flawed? No, because we're not there yet, and that's okay, right? I think for most of us, not everyone is an early adopter to change. Most of us take a long time until it's something that's mainstream or is actually happening, whether we're talking about Ubers or Airbnbs or any shifts we see in society, right? It takes time. And so I've been pleasantly surprised, though, because one teacher who reached out to me after reading, she said, it just felt like I was being seen for the first time, that everything I was going through, I wasn't crazy, and I went, oh my gosh, that's so beautiful that you felt seen by the frustrations of the system itself, right? Now, here's the other thing. I think a lot of teachers are aware that the system is flawed. And at the same time, they are doing a job within the system, and that's their responsibility, right? It's every person who works in a toxic workplace because it's their job, and they can sit here and try to shift the culture, or they can kind of just go with it, right? And so I think a lot of people kind of just put up with it. And I think for a lot of teachers, it's fueled by the love of the job. It's fueled by their students. And so for them, they're going, do I fight all of this? Or do I just either succumb to what do I actually have control over? And in many ways, I go, I understand. I understand why you feel that way. And a lot of what I talk about in the book is when we become more conscious, the job can actually feel lighter. It can actually feel better. I think a lot of times teachers, and I felt this when I was in the classroom too, it felt that everything was being always added on. Right, we have a new curriculum. It needs to happen now. We have this professional development workshop this weekend. You need to be here for that, right? Whatever it may be. So it always felt like the pile never ended. And I always say when we become conscious and more present, there's a calmness that we can actually bring into space that can actually shift our teaching in so many beautiful ways. However, it's hard to sit here and say these are the quantitative results, right? Sometimes you just have to experience it and feel it in order to understand. And teachers who are doing this do see shifts in themselves, right? Those are the same teachers who may decide to stay in the classroom or may decide to shift this culture within their own school setting. But it has to start with that first step of kind of being uncomfortable, right? And really asking yourself, like, what am I doing in the classroom? What does it take to be conscious? I always say, and I know I talk about it in the book, like in many ways, it's easy to be on autopilot. It's easy to go with the system because everyone's doing it, right? And we are a tribal kind of society where groupthink is a big part of how we live our lives. And so to break out of that is not necessarily easy, but it can be easy for yourself, right? It's just how you are showing up. There's beauty in that in itself. And so how do we do it to lighten ourselves a little bit? And at least that was my journey as a teacher, from going to survival mode to trying to be more conscious in the classroom.
When you're connecting with teachers, I wonder, how do you meet the challenge of, and I imagine it's a challenge, you refer to it in your book, the fact that teachers are very, obviously very, part of their identity is merged with what they do. And what we do. I mean, I think, it's common. You talk to educators, and I think we all agree, you're not there for the money. If you were, you're in the wrong place. You're there to make a difference. You want to, it's an altruistic thing. You've got this reason to get out of bed in the morning. You want to do your best, so the part of your identity is explicitly connected with what you do. And therefore, it can be tricky to talk about this without triggering feelings of defensiveness. And I notice you do seed the book with caveats, and hey, I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about the system. It is in there, and I saw that and I thought it's good that you put that in there. But in terms of actually, consulting and working day to day with teachers and things, how do you approach that to sort of ensure that they're not going into a reactive mode?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is to acknowledge it. Is to understand that is going to happen and there is going to be resistance. And also it's to understand that not everyone will be bought in, and that's also okay. But how do you get the majority of the people in this space to feel seen, feel heard, and understand that they may come out of here with an outcome that could actually provide more relief for them, right? So if you are to sit there and go, these are the pain points, these are the frustrations we all have. So I'm not sitting here and saying that I'm going to somehow make your job necessarily easier. But what I am saying is through this work and becoming more conscious and self-aware, we may be able to look at our job and our students and our lives very differently. And so how do we kind of cultivate that mindset, even if the external circumstances are not changing, right? And a lot of what I talk about in the book is our external reality is a lot of it is a reflection of our inner. So if we're not doing that work, then we are going to continue to have those external frustrations and be reactionary and so forth. So I think a part is acknowledgement. And the second is sharing my own story. You know, what I talk a lot about is I never questioned it either, right? I was the teacher who was standing in the classroom and, you know, trying to figure out classroom management and trying to instill fear in my students and, you know, doing all of the things to try to just get through the day, to be honest. And it took me years to get to the point and went, wait, when I become more conscious of myself, whether it's through personal self-care or doing the really deep work of unlearning, then I can come back into the classroom with a very just different set of eyes. That's how I see it, right? I think in the book I talk like you're putting on a new pair of glasses. That's really it. And you see things clearer. And so that's really what it is too, because as we know, we all resonate with stories. And so to even share mine and go, I was sitting there right with you and I felt all of these things, and really tapping into that, I think is very important. And then being able to kind of give the step-by-step process to start that journey. And one of the first things I say is, I think it's really critical that we look at our own educational experiences. A lot of what we do is it's a check mark, right? Our society says, well, you go to elementary school, then middle school, then high school. That's just the way it is. Like, that's just how we do things here, right? And it makes sense because standardization is a big part of our schooling system since we're serving so many kids. Now, with that said, it's now asking ourselves, well, how do I get through a journey of going, what was my educational experience? You know, what did I perceive as success growing up? What did my parents tell me? What did my teachers tell me? What type of student was I? Because until we do, we will constantly, that will affect the way we show up in the classroom because we have all of these personalized experiences. And one thing I say is everyone has their own unique story, right? Everyone has their own unique experience with education, which is why it is even more critical to actually look back and try to understand what we went through. And some may say, well, that's irrelevant. You know, why do I have to look at my own schooling? I'm here. I know the skill sets. You know, I'm learning how to lesson plan. Like, this is bogus. This is crazy. Yet, I felt that when I started doing that unlearning process, I was shocked, right? Because I was applauding the students that were like me. And I didn't know that. It was so unconscious. I didn't even know that I was applauding the students who turned in their homework and were, you know, quite on the nerdy side and kind of like the good kids, you know, and sitting in their desks all silent. Why did I connect with them so much? Well, because they reminded me of me when I was young. And that took deep reflection to understand that, because I was actually negating so many students in that classroom who were amazing and brilliant and gifted. And yet I was not addressing my own biases in that moment, right? And so I think that's why it's also so critical, because we all know these are kids, this is their lives, and how we message and communicate with them is so important for their development and how they see themselves.
I mean, this sounds like in sort of getting into what you mean by consciousness, because it is something, it's like an evolving concept through the book. I mean, I remember you mentioned, I mean, you know, vulnerability, social emotional learning, authentic self, holistic approach, and then at a whole school level being preventative instead of reactive in terms of, you know, the way we take responsibility for charge and care of young people when we know that they're being failed, you know, by the community or by, you know, sometimes at home there's things going on that they can't control. So there's a lot, you know, there's a very expansive concept of consciousness in the book. And I wonder if before you start talking about this with educators, I imagine that one thing you've got to do is really get them to look critically at themselves. And you mentioned the teacher, the mask in there, and that really struck me, because the teacher persona versus the home persona, you know, and the authentic self, that you can't bring that to work. I think is something that would resonate with quite a lot of teachers, you know, and I still remember being in the classroom and how I found it very difficult to just go directly from the classroom, and I was teaching in a university, to go skateboarding with friends in the same clothes. because I had to physically, even though that my clothes are, I've got one outfit for everything, you know, but I felt like I physically had to change them to feel that teacher persona disappearing. So I felt like the skateboarder version of me, you know, and it was only through that process that I thought, that's not right. I should be me in any situation. And it, you know, that was, I remember the moment of realizing that. You mention it in the book. How do you help educators with actually deconstructing that persona and encouraging them to bring their authentic self to you know, to show up as themselves in all situations? How do you actually do that?
That's a great question. And, you know, the first thing I will say is we all code switch. We all have to do that. That's the role we play in the world, right? Who I am as a sister might be different as how I show up as a daughter, how I show up as a friend. So we're always putting on roles. And, you know, my push is not to sit here and say, well, just be how you are when you're on the couch watching Netflix while you're teaching. I mean, we know that's really unrealistic. What I am saying, though, is somehow as teachers, I think we have to ask ourselves, you know, at what point are we putting on a mask because we feel it's going to either protect us or because we're doing it as a point of validation, but we're actually not doing it to connect with our students on a deeper level. And so that's ultimately what it is. So what I am saying is, you know, and I talk about in my book is, hey, you know, I used to show up every day and I was like, I'm the authority figure. You must respect me. And I didn't even know I was putting on a mask because that is not who Komal is. Okay. But I thought that that was what would resonate with them. So I did put on an inauthentic mask. And over time, what I realized is no, like what my kids really need to see is me. And that doesn't need to be, you know, all of my secrets. What it does need to be is, hey, this is my family, this is my culture, this is how I was brought up, you know, the human aspects of me. Hey, you know, today Miss Shah is feeling a little down because my family left. And sometimes that's really hard when they leave. And it's making me feel kind of sad today, but I'm still going to be here for all you. But I wanted to model for them that I also have emotions, right? And that I'm also going through things just to validate where maybe my students were without realizing it. And so I think it more comes down to that. Now, here's the thing though, for most of us, our entire lives, we have been given permission for some emotions, but not others. And so to model that vulnerability in the classroom is actually very difficult for most educators. And they also may say the all questioning thing, which is, well, we don't have time, right? We don't have time. We have a lesson to teach. And I always say, you know, that's true. But when we're older and we're adults and we're in the workplace, there is something about being seen and heard. There are those moments where check-ins where we actually like it. You know, you see the people who grind in the workplace and they do get burnt out because in many ways, the human aspect of themselves is not being cultivated. And our students are the exact same. So even taking out that 5 minutes to connect with them and share a story from the weekend or share something in your life is very, very important. Now, here's the thing though, I think for most educators, it is hard to deconstruct that until they really reflect on their own educational experiences.
Right.
You know, to
So
sit
it all
here
starts
and say,
with that first then.
yes, because hey, you know, you have a mask on. People will be like, what are you talking about? I have a mask on, you know?
Yeah.
That's not gonna work. So it really starts with yourself, and that reflection is the first step in because it's personal and everyone has a personal story with it and it's easy to access. Okay, now we can take what happened in your life. Now let's actually correlate it or connect it with where you are now. Do you see similarities? Do you see differences? Do you see the idea of success you were given growing up? Does that actually matter to you now? What do you think success looks like? Hey, you're maybe not just a teacher, you're also a parent. You have children. Okay, what does that look like for you now? Right. And so it's making those connections that can kind of shed those layers slowly. And, you know, the other reality of it all is that the reason we put the mask on, or at least I realize, is that sense of validation. If I'm the authority figure in the classroom, then my kids are looking at me. I am the person who makes the decisions. I am the one who gives them permission to make choices. So at the end of the day, I hold the reins. I hold the control. And this could be consciously or unconsciously. A lot of times we don't even realize we're doing it. You know, I recently talked to a teacher in Germany, Christian, and, you know, we had that conversation where I said, well, I think it's important that you ask yourself, you know, what are the systems you have in your classroom that are about your kids, or are they about you? Who are they for? You know? And that was kind of like oh, that's interesting, you know? And I said, well, because a lot of times we like as educators, because a lot of times we're not appreciated. And so we like the idea of, well, the student has to come to me before they can leave, or, you know, the student has to come to me before they can get X, Y, Z. And so it becomes about permission. And the reality is our kids are so brilliant and so much better than that. You know, like I used to have kids who would get up out of their desk to get something from their backpack, or, you know, get something for the back. I was just never one to be like, what are you doing?
No.
You know, I'm like, you're a human being. I'm sure you're doing just fine. But we had built that foundation of trust on a human element of things that allowed for us to have that, where they knew too that they would not do anything out of insensitivity to me, right? It was just, oh, well, she trusts me. It's, you know, it's okay. Like, she knows that it's fine. So that was a long-winded question, but I would say it takes time. I would say it takes time.
I'll bet it does. And it's, again, we're kind of broadening out. That's another thing I can add into part of the definition of consciousness, which is building relationships with your learners as well as a foundation stone. I mean, there's something that there's another narrative that, or a theme that runs through your book, and you alluded to it there when you talked about the example with Christian about systems that were in place. You know, are they for you? Are they for your learners? And thinking about permission and control. And it does seem like when you zoom out, so much of this is about administrative convenience, or about kind of this creating a self-reinforcement of a control structure, which goes back to your original point about, you know, from it being its military and industrial roots of education. It does seem like I keep coming back to the same phrase whenever I have these conversations, that the progress comes from letting go in a certain sense. No, I mean, trying to control and measure everything, and a lot of the metrics, as you said, you know, the A, B, C, the 1, 2, 3. It's great in an Excel sheet. It's really easy to report and run up the flagpole to ministers and things like that, and they understand. And but that's administrative convenience. It doesn't suit learners. It doesn't reflect learning. And all the stuff that does reflect learning, as you say, is very difficult to measure. But it comes down to a point where it's like, well, of course we need to know if we're doing well, but if that needs to be done, say, qualitatively, if it needs to be through conversation, if it needs to be through reflection, you know, what is the fear around that? And again, it's just that letting go and being like, okay, I'm not completely in control. I'm not mandating this situation. It seems like a very difficult thing for people to actually embrace, I find, especially the further up the chain you go.
Wow. I mean, that's a beautiful point. And, you know, I will say letting go is quite the liberation. But I mean, how many of us, you know, even struggle to forgive someone, right? Letting go is very hard. Most of us as humans have a very difficult time with that, including myself. And so when you have structures in place, like I said, you know, it's easier to kind of follow the rules and the structure and the hierarchy of it all, because change means I now have to adopt a new mindset. My job will become harder, and I might have to put in more work. And it also just leads to a lot of uncertainty. Letting go leads to a lot of uncertainty. But what I have found in my life, it's the most beautiful thing. And a very tangible example is when I was in the classroom. You know, how did I shift from being in the front to being in the back? Well, a big part of that was letting go, right? It was going, well, what happens when my students, you know, when they realize this is their classroom, right, as well, it's not mine. So how do I show that? How do I cultivate that? What does that look like? And of course it was scary. You know, it's not easy. And there were mistakes and errors made throughout that process, but a lot of it, I was very vulnerable with my students. You know, I said, I want this to be about you. And there's going to be times where it's not going to work, but we're going to figure it out together. And ultimately, by my 5th year, I mean, they were running the show. And so I was like, it is possible, right? When we let go of that control, or for me, I really had to let go of the need for validation from my students and realize that the best thing that I could be for them was be a guide. I didn't need to be the authority figure. I could just be a guide in their lives. And in so many ways, they respected me more, right? Because they're going, oh, I feel empowered in this space. So I can now go ahead and let go of these expectations, even of what a teacher is or who they have to be in this space. In terms of administration and what you mentioned, I always say, oh, until I'm in the top, powerful positions where I can shift things, the reality is that it is very hard. And there's a reason that a lot of times people start their own schools, right? Or, kind of go a different route or do the alternative, because it's so hard to make those hierarchical changes that we're seeing out of conveniency, out of funding, right? And so we forget who is at the bottom. But the funny thing is are they really at the bottom? Because we're all here for our learners. That's why we're here. So they're actually at the top. They should be the utmost importance in terms of what we're saying. And I don't actually talk about this much in my book, but I went to business school and I was doing it through the lens of being in education. And the first thing I had to realize was, oh my gosh, these kids that we have in our schools, they are consumers. They are our clients, right? We are here for them. And yet, what are the feedback systems? Where's the A/B testing? Where's all of these things you're supposed to do in a business setting to make sure a product or service is conducive to your consumer? And unfortunately, the truth of the matter is then it comes down to the child-adult relationship a lot of times, because there is a power dynamic there. And so we sometimes negate that they're the consumer and we go, well, we know what's best for them. They don't know what success looks like. Like college is the way to go, or this, and I'm not saying any of those things are bad. What I'm saying is we kind of make those choices for them without actually asking them what they want. And there are schools out there who are shifting the model. And that's also beautiful to see that it is happening. People are trying, but the hierarchy, especially in the public schooling system, seems to be the same. And I'm not sure how it is in Scotland, but at least that's what it is like here in the US.
Well, I mean, interesting you mentioned that, because in Scotland there has just been quite a scathing review by the OECD about the Scottish Qualifications Authority, which the Scottish authorities, to their credit, immediately moved to disband it and bring in stakeholders, bring in parents, learners, and teachers, and say what can be better in its place. And actually it's an interesting point. It leads me on to the next thing I want to talk to you about, which is your kind of consultancy work, because in Scotland we have a system. We've got the Curriculum for Excellence, which I encourage you to have a look at, because I think you'll find that if you read that, now apart from the stigma around the word curriculum, which makes my hair stand on end, actually it's not a bad word itself. It's just a structure, a system. When you look at how it's written in Scotland, it has all the right things in there. It has a focus on well-being. It has a focus on social emotional learning. It has, teachers are absolutely encouraged to step back and be guides and not occupy the space in which decision making takes place, in which leadership can't flourish, because you're hogging all the space at the front anyway. So, there's all that stuff is endemic in the system, but the expression is different. And there's a wild variety of ways that it shows up, and we still have. I mean, I spoke to somebody who just came through teacher training, and they were still talking about things like learning styles, when that's been completely debunked, several years ago, and it's actually very harmful, I think. So there's a bit of a disconnect, and things are struggling to catch up. But I like your approach, because I think if we're going to have change, we need these you've got these kind of avant-garde outliers. You've got Learn Life and the Green School and New School and High Tech High and all these places. They're great, because they're showing all the skeptics that say, well, that can't work in reality, say, hey, look at those guys. They're, go and speak to any of the learners there and tell me that we're mistaken here. So we need those examples. But at the same time, and I'm very conscious of this, as we wait for this very slow transition to happen, what about all these learners? And I think about the very personal examples you gave in your book, and I really felt for each one of them that strong sense of like, are we letting people down? And we can't wait 20 years for a systemic change. So is your approach very much to try to make the maximum amount of an impact within the existing system to kind of meet the system where it is and do the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people? That seems to be the impression I get from what you're trying to do.
Yes, that's a start, right? I mean, if I could sit here and say, I want to revolutionize the whole system, yes, I do.
Yeah.
And I also have to be, that's idealistic. And right now I'm realistic. And I do think we have to start on the ground, and we have to start with individual people. And a lot of what I say is, systems are made up of people. So if you want to change a system, you have to start with the people, and you have to change their mindsets first. And so absolutely, I do think there is something to say about having these conversations and getting people who otherwise maybe never thought about it to start really questioning themselves and the system. I've collaborated so much with people like yourself and so many others who want to innovate education, right? They see the flaws, they see things that are not working. They're taking their own kids out to try to figure out a new way for them to learn and to educate them, which is so beautiful to see. But I think all in all, there's a lot of people who are also kind of just doing this on autopilot because they have not learned anything different. And I hope that with these conversations, we can also work with those people as well, right? And not necessarily the skeptics, maybe people who've never had access or the accessibility to even have these conversations in the first place, And so I do think it starts there, because if you've seen with any revolution, it always starts with the people. It's the people who are standing up against something that they're not okay with. And so the question we have to ask is, where are the parents who are upset about it? Right? Because at the end of the day, the parents are also the ones who have a lot of power and say. If they are saying, I'm not going to send my child to the school, that's a lot of weight, because for the school, that's money, right? Yes, it's the child, but it's also how they get funded. So there is that conversation of, how do we also communicate with not only teachers, but also parents and the young people, and really trying to get everyone to go, hey, maybe this is not okay. How do we all come together to actually make change? Because this is not going to happen with just one vision, right? You can have a vision, but how are you going to get people to come together and have those conversations and really try to make things feel different and change it, right? So, yeah, I mean, this is where I'm at now. I hope at some point I can be in a position where maybe you can affect actual laws and things that are out there that we know don't support learners and their well-being. And I also know that this is all a journey. And so whatever change and impact you can make, even if it's one person, that is one more learner or 15 more learners who are going to have a different experience in the classroom. And that in itself is so powerful.
Yeah, and that's a powerful message, because it's I find it very seductive, the idea of a new paradigm, a new personal learning paradigm. And you referenced schools like Montessori and Steiner and things in your book, which are, I mean, it's for years being thought of as the alternative schools, and there's a kind of hippie vibe about it and blah blah blah. And yeah, it's so stigmatized. And now, you look at it with fresh eyes and going, they've been pretty right about most of it all along, and it was right there in front of us. It's interesting you mentioned parents as well, because not just in terms of parents coming forward and saying, hey, this is not working for my children, and I can see it with my own eyes, but it's at the other end as well, when we try to innovate and trying to mitigate or trying to work with parents' very natural fear that when you're operating out with what they see as the system, that there's a risk, of acceptance. Will my child, when they graduate from this school, will they be accepted into employment or into higher education because they haven't followed the traditional path? And so you're right. It's having conversations with as broad a spectrum of people as possible, in the sort of all the stakeholders around the children who are at the center, or the learners at the center, which is why, I mean, I definitely would encourage everyone to read this book, educators, parents, learners as well. I mean, I've sent it to a friend of mine who's always kind of talked to me about her regret that she didn't ever do a master's qualification. And every time I try to sort of say, hey, it's really not all it's cracked up to be, and it's not the be all and end all, and and I always get the same response. It's easy for you to say you've done a master's, and but actually I look back on it and I think I really, honestly, I have no intention of advising people to do that. And I work in higher education. And I often advise people, hey, it's not what it's cracked up to be, and be careful with your choices, and try to round these out a little bit. And or, hey, Mark, can you talk to my son or daughter? They're thinking about dropping out of school. Can you convince them to stay on and do this and that? And say, don't think I can do that.
I don't know if I can.
Yeah, 5 years ago I might have tried.
Yeah.
Because I believed in that, I was invested in it. But now it's very, very different. So with all that in mind, people kind of picking up your book and it runs through the message of your consulting as well. I think that the first question they would have, and I'd like to ask you about it, is consciousness in education. I mean, what is that to you?
Yeah. I think it's this awareness. One, it's awareness. That's what consciousness is. And I think what I'm trying to do is bring awareness to our educational system and the flaws that run in it. And I feel like, as we know, we have to acknowledge the problem first, right? I am here because there is a problem in the educational system, and I want us to become more conscious of it. If I was to talk to you in a more deeper level, then my hope is that we push away from this idea where a lot of our children are being taught that who they become is more important than who they are. And that messaging has become so embedded in our educational system. And I think it's time for us to really cultivate the consciousness that lies in our children in general. Our children, no matter what age they are, they have a lot of wisdom. They may not have all the knowledge, but they have wisdom. You can see any child when they're outside and they're playing in the dirt, and they're so present, and they're so in the moment, and they're learning about relationships and love and kindness and empathy. I mean, all of that is happening all the time. So the real question is, how do we cultivate what's within a child,
right,
as much as what they achieve? Because what we're seeing is people are spinning their wheels, and we saw it a lot during the pandemic. And then they're asking themselves, well, who am I? Because I've done all these things that everyone said I should, and yet I'm not fulfilled. Now, I say I'm not happy. I don't say that because I know happiness is an emotion that's fleeting, just like sadness or anything else. And happiness is short change. Someone's happy when they get a new car, and a week later, they don't think about them anymore, right? So it's very short-lived. But it's really about that fulfillment, what you feel within yourself. And how do you cultivate that? And I think our educational system has completely negated that. And to be fair, fulfillment doesn't necessarily get the people into jobs in the economy, right?
Or it gets them, into the wrong jobs. And I mean,
how are we going to get them in that job that's not really good if they're fulfilled, And I mean, I'm not sitting here and saying everyone's evil and manipulative, but what I am saying is that, how do we, I think we've seen in the past year or two of just people who had mental health problems and, were really struggling during these years, isolation, all of these things. And I think we really need to start asking ourselves these questions of like, what are we doing to who these people who were once children? They were students in a classroom. And, where did we go wrong? I think it's time for us to take some responsibility for that and to just sit here and say, well, they're educated, they got their high school diploma and they got their undergraduate degree. Okay, that is great. But what are we missing here? Right? What are we missing? Because obviously these people are educated and yet struggling, or, they are educated, but they're still quite prejudiced towards people. What's going on? And so I think that's really what consciousness is this idea of awareness and really, really shining a lot on the system itself.
It's a big call, isn't it? I mean, it's the more, I can see why you're busy. But I mean, it seems to come down to this idea, you mentioned the phrase, the whole empty vessel theory, which I think is still prevalent in education, that children are born with as blank pages, and we need to try to write the right things on that page, rather than flipping it around and saying, as you say, you observe a child playing. They know how to learn. Play-based learning is our birthright. Empathy is something that we develop cognitively and effectively as we grow. But yet, and creativity, which we've not mentioned yet. These things are our birthright. They are part of us, and yet they are drilled out of us by a system that does not support it, doesn't recognize it, doesn't value it, until later. You come back into the world of entrepreneurship and innovation and whatever, and suddenly it's prized again. But what happened in the middle? It's missing. And I often reflect on these phrases like, the midlife crisis, and people finding themselves and things like that. And I just feel like, if we didn't mess up what was already there in the first place, you wouldn't have that. People wouldn't be disappearing to sort of, I need to find out who I am in my 40s or whatever. They'd already know. There is an evolutionary part of it, but it's more purposeful all the way through.
Yeah, and that's I love that you said that, because similar to you, I always say, oh my gosh, when are we going to stop waiting for the bucket to overflow? We are just such a reactionary, it's the same conversations people are having. Well, just go to the doctor if you have pain here. It's like, well, where were the conversations about exercise and nutrition? It's just, there's no conversations about the preventative. It's always reactionary when something bad happens, right? Oh, I'm not feeling well, so I need to go to a therapist. There is absolutely nothing wrong to go to therapy. But what I am saying is, why are we waiting? And another thing I say too is, what can we do to equip young people with the tools and the understanding of themselves and how to navigate the realities of the world, because those will always exist, but do it in a way where they don't feel so confused and lost. They have those like tools in the back pocket, like, okay, I know what I can do to navigate the situation. Because for all of us, we're constantly going to be asking ourselves who we are. That's going to be a lifelong journey for all of us, right? But how do we do it from a place of questioning and curiosity and more alignment? And what I've seen personally is most people are just doing the day-to-day, and they're not thinking about any of it until one day something happens in their life, and then they question everything, right? Whether it's a divorce or a death or whatever it is that someone goes through. And so I always say these adults were once children, and that's how I always say, how do we cultivate conscious children to become conscious adults? That's really what it is, because we're so stuck in looking at the problems of our adults. But it's interesting. I think a lot of times we forget that they were once children, and that's the correlation I always want to make as well. Is that they were once kids. Like, what are we doing there? Because that's what's led them to become who they are now.
Do you think it's become easier in terms of your consulting? You mentioned things like you reference colleagues of yours working in mindfulness in education, for example. It seems like there is a wider embrace or openness towards consciousness in society in general. Where, for example, we are aware as a species collectively that to save the planet, we must develop the ability to empathize beyond generational boundaries. We have to empathize with future generations. This is that can only exist, right at the front here. It can't exist in a reactive limbic state.
Right.
And so I think that the narrative generally, there is a sense of things opening up in society, perhaps with access to education through technology, more discussion, more sharing. Things are moving that way, and things like mindfulness and meditation and things, are now being backed up with the hard science, neuroscience, to say, hey, this actually happens. The idea of a third eye is not just something you see in drawings anymore. You can see it in neural imaging. You can see this thing lighting up when you're meditating, and it seems like everything's kind of coming together to support being able to talk about these things in more traditional settings, I guess. Is that your experience when you go into schools and you're talking about consciousness, mindfulness, self-reflection, authentic self? Which it sounds a bit Oprah Winfrey to a lot of people, or it did 10 years ago. I wonder now, do you find people are ready to say, yeah, this is something I want to learn about?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I think, digital innovation, the applications that are now out there that makes all of these things also quite accessible for people has led to a different mindset. And also, I think, again, I always bring it back to COVID and the pandemic. I think a lot of people were forced to really sit with themselves and really start to explore some of these tools, because otherwise it was very difficult to get through it. And so I think there is definitely a conversation. And I always say the things I'm talking about, I'm not sitting here and saying no one is doing it, because people are doing it. There are conversations around mindfulness. There are curriculums that are being implemented in schools about socio-emotional learning. Here is two things that though I will say that I have a little bit of pushback on. And the first is, okay, great, you're doing mindfulness, but how are you presenting it? Are you presenting it as a stress reliever? Are you presenting it as it will make you more productive? Because that is still in the eyes of capitalism. That is not actually the true essence of these tools. They really are about bringing back to yourself those parts of you that in many ways a lot of us are not connected with anymore, because we have been conditioned by the world to not necessarily connect with it. So it's to go back to that inner voice, that intuition, that gut feeling, those moments when something lights you up versus not, and actually going with that, right? Those moments. Yeah. And so that really is why mindfulness and meditation and all of those, if you look at ancient teachings, that's where it all originated from. It's from those modalities, but in the Western world, it has been presented in my opinion, not the most authentic way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I will say that, yes, schools are doing it. Yes, there's more conversations. There's more programming for teachers as well, which is beautiful. And I have to say, is it supplemental or is it foundational? Mm-hmm. Because those are two very different things. It's like, are you at the workplace and do you have a wellness week? Or is wellness integrated in the culture of the workplace?
A wellness week, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and that's common too. Yeah, I know, and it's common, and I've fallen into that trap, and I've been, asked to help produce materials on, well-being workshops or social emotional learning workshops, and failed to ask the question, how are you embedding this? How is this supported by a whole school approach? Because It's not just a workshop. And by the way, I'm not entirely convinced that the people who are delivering it have got their own house in order anyway.
I think that's a good point.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. So I mean, that brings us to kind of really the last question I'd like to ask you, and that's about your consulting in terms of what you offer. I mean, to schools. I mean, I don't know if you work directly with parents or you work directly with learners or whatever, but in your consulting, I imagine it's generally schools who are your clients. I want to say that. What is it you actually offer to them?
Yeah, so something I do offer are professional development workshops. And so schools want me to come in and work with their teachers and their educators and start to have these kind of unpeeling is a way to say it, and have those types of conversations. That's kind of something that I love, facilitation and workshops and so forth. I've also worked with a client where we worked more on the back end of things. So that was more of an organizational and cultural shift, because I do have a business background. And so consciously thinking about how do you build and sustain a culture within a space that will be something that can work for not just 1 year, but more than 1 year. And what does that look like, right? So kind of the strategic planning with that. And then I'm also open to having those cultural shifts and conversations, right? Like, how do we shift mindsets within this space? How do we create a culture that actually values all of these things, and actually not only values it for their students, but also for themselves? And I think those conversations need to happen, but also can be implemented and integrated with practices and tools, but it takes consistency, it takes work. And so being able to come in and actually have those conversations with leadership and then also implement and plan it out, I think is something that I also love to do as well. And so that's kind of where I am willing to provide with my consulting. And then also at the moment, I'm also speaking. And so seeking out conferences and other places where I can kind of continue this conversation, and then also work with like-minded individuals and network and kind of have those conversations again of, what does it look like to integrate it? Because also knowing, just like one size fits all does not work in our schooling system, this idea of consciousness will also not work with one size fits all. It's really becoming aware of the situation at hand and then coming up a solution that works for them.
Okay, so and the typical sort of time, I mean, I guess it's all fluid, isn't it? But I mean, so you're ranging from these workshops, which are, I guess, as you call it, the unpeeling, the professional development. They're really kind of, it's planting the seed, isn't it?
Yeah.
And sort of talking about, well, how can you bring it forward? So it's a bit more over to you now. And do you work kind of more long term with any institutions?
Yeah, I mean, that's a goal. At the moment, I have not, but I would love to do that because I do think this is something that takes a time and it takes work. And, in the education system, when I was working, the one thing I saw is that so many times it's so fragmented. People, schools get excited about a new idea, but then it falls off because people are overwhelmed and there's so much happening and so much chaos. And so it's not necessarily always a priority. And as we know, without consistency, it's not going to sustain itself. And so being able to do the long-term projects is ideal because then it can actually lead to growth over time and also accountability in that moment as well.
In terms of accountability, do you try to have a kind of consciousness champion within the school? I mean, is there a way of identifying within the professional development workshops, like, hey, you're the person, you've got to I think be the impulse behind this?
Building relationships is important, especially as an outsider, right? You're coming in. And so observation and being able to really get to know people and really try to understand and build those relationships. I mean, if that's as a teacher, that is definitely important now. So that's very, very important. And as we know, I mean, in the classroom too, when the kids who kind of everyone geared towards and listened to, you always try to get that kid on your side a little bit to bring some leadership into the classroom. And so that's something you need with adults as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Komal, it's been amazing talking to you, and I thoroughly enjoyed your book, and I would thoroughly recommend it. It's called Raise Your Hand, Call for Consciousness in Education. And I will link to your website when we repost this as well, because I think it'll be really interesting for people as well, just to see this approach, that you're not kind of going in and, hey, let's tinker with the curriculum or let's train teachers in how to teach better or something. It's a much more fundamental level, isn't it? It's much more about stepping back. And I don't think there's a lot of that out there. But in my limited experience with seeing programs that are in this orbit, they have the most impact of anything. Because, teachers, as you say, they when do they ever get the chance to address that innate kind of dissonance, that feeling like something's not right? But when do they ever get the chance to actually stop and reflect? They're so overwhelmed. They're so frustrated, so it's such a gift that I think that a school would give you a call and say, it's a privilege, to say, we're going to make this time to step back and think about what we're doing here and why we're doing it, and address our own experiences and this learned behavior and how it manifests itself, because I don't think I've ever seen that in any kind of professional development course.
I mean, I always say, in servant leadership, if you want to serve the clients or the customers well, you have to serve your employees well. And I think it's more true than ever in the educational system. Our teachers need to be valued and seen. And yes, they deserve to go to a professional development workshop. That's not about classroom instruction, but it's about them. I think it's about time that we start seeing them for who they are.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Well, I look forward to following your progress and, continuing to see your posts. And I've never seen you post about dancing. And you mentioned it in the book, and you say, that your
Yes.
learning experience should all make you feel like you feel when you dance. I would like to see some more
Yes.
posts about that.
Okay, sounds good. You've challenged me. I'll have to make that happen now.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much for your time and the inspiration, and I genuinely, authentically mean that. I got so much out of it. And
Thank
I'm
you.
very grateful that you read the book, and I will be spreading the word about it. I think it's something that everyone should read.
Thank you so much, Mark. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.